Alright guys, we are back for section 11. Here is our funny internet picture of this session. See, it's funny, right? Alright, so today we're going to talk a little bit about criminological theory and how that applies to cybercrimes, and mostly we're going to talk about how existing theories apply to cybercrime, and this is going to be a really quick and dirty explanation of these different theories. If there are any criminologists watching, I apologize for how kind of quick and dirty these explanations are going to be, but these videos have to be relatively short, and I'm hoping that if you're a student and you're watching this, you are going to take an entire course just on crim theory, where you'll learn a lot more about these theories than this quick explanation that I'm going to give you, okay? So first thing we got to talk about is subcultures. Subcultures are, most of them are completely innocuous, but they're cultures within a larger culture that have their own values, norms, traditions, rituals, things like that, okay? For instance, I'm a Star Wars fan, right? Huge Star Wars fan. And we have our own kind of weird separate subculture. We have our own values, you know, we talk about, you know, good Jedi versus evil Jedi. We have our own norms and rituals, you know, we have our own holiday, May the 4th, because, you know, May the 4th be with you. Yeah, all right. We have special terminology and slang. The internet is really good at creating these subcultures. And again, most of them are completely innocuous. I would even argue that kind of meme culture that has just arisen in the last decade or so is absolutely exemplifies this kind of subculture thing. Digital piracy, you know, pirates that get together and talk about ways of defeating encryption and ways of, you know, uploading and downloading and doing all that stuff. That is absolutely its own little subculture within the larger culture of the internet, right? So a lot of the different crimes that we see in cybercrime have their own distinct subcultures attached. You know, digital piracy, but also child porn has its own subculture, hacking has its own subculture. All that stuff really has a unique, different style to it within that larger culture of the internet, okay? But now to get to the actual theories, okay? The first one we're going to talk about is learning theory. The first guy to really talk about and describe learning theory was this guy named Sutherland back in like the 40s. And he basically said crime isn't necessarily economic, it's not necessarily geographic, it's not necessarily biological, which were all ideas that had kind of come before. But crime is learned. If you spend time around people who are committing crimes, you're not only going to learn how to commit crimes, but you're going to learn kind of the values and beliefs that kind of crime is normal, crime is expected, crime is something I should do, okay? And then along comes this guy, Akers, a few decades later. I think he was writing in the 90s, but don't quote me on that. And he expands on Sutherland's learning theory and adds a few other things. So with Akers, really, there's kind of 4 different things that Akers says are involved in this whole learning theory process. And in no particular order, they are differential association, which is kind of what Sutherland was talking about. Hanging out with people, whether they're your family, your peers, the people you're spending time with. If they do bad things, you are going to do bad things, okay? Then there's definitions, and definitions here, the term also comes from Sutherland, but it's more, it's about that instilling the values and the norms and the beliefs that crime is expected, crime is good, crime is something I should do. And then Akers adds in the differential reinforcement, meaning that if you're part of this group and you're learning from these people, you know, the people you're hanging out with, they steal a car's, the little thing on the front of the cars. That was a big thing when I was in school. if you wanted to be a bad kid and prove you were cool, you would steal one of the hood ornaments. That's the word I'm looking for. And the cooler the hood ornament you could steal, the more kind of prestige you got amongst your deviant peers. And that differential reinforcement is something that Akers thought was very important to learning theory. So you got praise from your peers when you did that deviant thing. And then finally there's imitation, which is kind of related but different, where you see somebody doing something and you want to imitate them, so you do the same kind of thing. And Akers says this is much more important at the beginning of the process. So once you've found this group of deviants or the subculture or the, whatever group you're spending time with, you start with imitation. They do a thing, so you're like, okay, that's how I'm supposed to act in this group, so you do the thing. Then you get the differential reinforcement, and that kind of leads you to becoming a deviant person. Make sense? Again, it's far more complicated than that. That is the very, very kind of simple version of this. But people have looked at learning theory and tried to apply it to cybercrime, and it has been one of the most successfully, it's most commonly researched and most successfully researched theories as specifically applied to cybercrime. Basically, whatever cybercrime it has been applied to, or investigated, or tried to be linked with, has been successful. There has been a statistically significant correlation between things like if you hang out with people who commit digital piracy, you are much more likely to commit digital piracy. The kind of counter argument to that is it you learning to do that from them, or is it the fact that you wanted to do it which caused you to seek out those deviant peers? That can be a very difficult thing to kind of tease out, whether it's, A causing B or B causing A in this case. But it is very much studied in the field of cybercrime, and it has been very research has shown it to be incredibly predictive of cybercrime. Next theory we're going to talk about, the general theory of crime. This one is kind of deceptively simple. These two guys, Gottfredson and Hershey, they got together and they basically said, first off, it's in criminological theory, there are two different kinds of theories. Some theories tried to explain why people who are normally good have something happen to them, or something does something, and then they go on and commit crime. General theory of crime, though, is a control theory, meaning that it assumes that people are evil, people are bad, people are by nature deviant, but something from outside prevents most of us from being deviant. And thus, if someone's a criminal, it's not that they had something happen to them to make them a criminal, it's that they didn't have something happen to prevent them from being a criminal. Does that make sense? So the general theory of crime just basically says crime and what causes someone to commit crimes is a matter of self-control. Those who have high self-control don't commit crime. Those who have low self-control are the ones who are going to go out and commit these different crimes. So, if I have high self-control, but I'm broke and I need money to pay my rent, and, oh man, what am I going to do? Well, if I have high self-control, I go out and get a second job, which, doesn't have that immediate gratification, but it's probably better in the long run. If I have low self-control, I'm like, man, I really need this money for rent. I've got to go rob a liquor store, So it's kind of deceptively simple, though, because if you actually take a criminology class, you'll find out how it gets far more complicated than just my simple explanation here. But for our purposes, that's kind of close enough. So applying that to cybercrime, it's kind of complex because cybercrime is a very broad kind of crime. And, going and knocking over a liquor store is fairly easy. Basically anybody, even without a weapon can do it if they can convince the clerk they have a weapon. So it's kind of, does the general theory of crime apply to computer crime? Really depends on whether you think computer crime is simple or complex. And it's really both. Something like cyberbullying, once you understand the basics of how to use social media, which, it's the 21st century, most of us understand at least the basics of social media. once you understand that, cyberbullying is a really easy crime to commit. On the other hand, hacking into a bank and stealing money would be a very, very complex crime. That's not necessarily easily shown to be a lack of self-control, because it's a long, complex process. You have to learn a whole bunch of stuff. Even committing the crime itself can take days or weeks. So theorists have kind of tried to apply this to some computer crime, but not all, I guess, is kind of the short version of how this has been applied to cybercrime. Make sense? Okay, we're moving on. The opposite side of that is about low self-control and victimization. So the last slide I was talking about low self-control and how that creates offenders. But now let's talk about how low self-control can also predict victimization. So if I have low self-control, I'm not only more likely to become a cyber criminal, I'm much more likely to become a victim of a cybercrime, right? So some researchers have looked at why that is, essentially. And some of the ideas, some of the stuff coming out of the research is that people with low self-control enjoy risk, which can lead to more victimization, for what I hope are obvious reasons. They also have low empathy. So if somebody, contacts them with a, money-making scheme where they're gonna make a whole bunch of money very simply by taking money out of the hands of elderly people and babies and stuff, they're more likely to go with it, even though it's hurting other people, kind of thing. If you have low self-control, you're much more likely to get frustrated very quickly, very easily, and that causes or can cause an escalation in any given problem, which can bring it up the ramp up to the point where some kind of crime is committed. Everything from, cyberbullying to stalking to scams and frauds, piracy, right? A lot of people get frustrated by, the fact that if they buy a DVD, there's kind of all those unskippable previews and there's FBI warnings, and it takes like 5 minutes before the stupid movie starts. If you have self-control, you're okay. You can wait that 5 minutes, no big deal. If you have low self-control, you're going to get frustrated wasting that time in your eyes, and you're just going to go ahead and pirate the movie where you can get it, kind of instantly started. And then also that frustration can lead people to stop using their security. You'd be amazed at how many times I've talked to people who have a virus on their computer or ransomware on their computer, and I say, hey, don't you have antivirus software which should have caught this? And they're like, well, yeah, but it was annoying me, so I turned it off. That's low self-control causing somebody to become a victim. Okay? Never, ever, ever turn your antivirus off. It's trying to tell you something is wrong for a reason. Don't be like, oh, be quiet, I really want this file or whatever. You need to understand what that antivirus is trying to tell you and listen to it instead of turning it off, because, boom, you're a victim. Make sense? All right. So general strain theory. So back in the 30s, there was this guy named Merton who came up with one of the first strain theories. And Merton basically said crime is a result of an adaptation to a failure to achieve economic goals. So we all want the American dream. We all want, the big house with a white picket fence and 2.5 kids. But if you realize you're not going to be able to reach that goal for some reason, that causes strain, and many people can adapt to that strain by committing crime. Many decades later, along comes this guy named Agnew, and Agnew says, I like where you're going with that, but I don't think it necessarily has to just be failure to achieve these economic goals. It's a much bigger world than that. Strain can be caused by much more than that. It's more complex than just economic goals. It can be economic goals, but it doesn't have to be. There's lots of other kinds of goals that people have. So Agnew says there's basically 4 things that lead to crime. The first is that same thing, failure to achieve goals, but they're not necessarily economic goals. Let's say it's my goal to become an Olympic swimmer. And, that's not an economic goal. That's just kind of a personal goal. And if I fail to achieve that, that's going to cause strain in my life, right? If I want to be an astronaut, which I very much did when I was in high school. Oh, I wanted to be an astronaut so desperately. But then I learned that, at least at the time, the height limit for astronauts was like 6'3", and I am much taller than that. So I realized that day that there was no way I was really ever going to be an astronaut. That is a failure to achieve goals. But in addition to that, Agnew says there's also the removal of positive stimuli, i.e. something good that you have gets taken away. That can be a loss of a job. It can be the death of a pet or a spouse. It can be, a spouse or a boyfriend, girlfriend leaving you. It can be your computer breaking, right? There's all kinds of different removal of positive stimuli, and they range from the very small to the very major, right? The death of a spouse would obviously be a really major removal of positive stimuli. Whereas, if my stupid water bottle is empty and I'm really thirsty and I don't want to walk downstairs to get a drink, that can be a very, very, very minor removal of positive stimuli. Make sense? The flip side of that is the presence of negative stimuli, i.e. something bad enters your life. The sitcom stereotype is your mother-in-law moves in. But it can be also, if you're a teenager, it can be getting pregnant. A lot of, that can be a negative stimuli in a lot of cases. It can be you get a broken foot, right? So you're got this pain in your foot, But those 3 things happen to everybody, right? Everybody on the planet sometimes fails to achieve their goals. Nobody achieves every single one of their goals. Everybody on the planet has some kind of removal of positive stimuli at some point in their life for some reason. Everybody on the planet has presence of negative stimuli for some reason. But most people have adequate coping skills, right? If I hurt my foot, I'm going to take medicine. If I get angry with my wife, I'm going to go hit a punching bag. If my parents ground me, I'm going to go into my room and listen to really terrible, sad music really loud. Those are adequate coping mechanisms. Those are non-criminal coping mechanisms. But some people, because they don't have those adequate coping mechanisms, will turn to crime to kind of make up for those 3 things above, right? So if my failure to achieve goals is a lack of money for drugs, my negative stimuli is the withdrawal symptoms. The removal of positive stimuli is I'm not high anymore. If I don't have adequate coping mechanisms, which in that case would be, going to rehab or finding some help, I'm going to go rob a 7-Eleven to get money for drugs. Make sense? Again, it's more complicated than this. This is the very simple version. There hasn't been a lot of research examining whether strain theory impacts cybercrime or not. The one area of cybercrime where it has attempted to be researched is in the areas of cyberbullying. And what they found is these 4 things are predictive of both cyberbullying and being a victim of cyberbullying. So just like low self-control, all of these things listed predict both being a bully and being a victim of bullying. So I'm going to pause it there. See you in the next section.